So this is it, the big one. The big article taking a look behind the scenes at what went wrong with Cyberpunk 2077. This is coming from Jason Schreier for Bloomberg, titled Inside Cyberpunk 2077's Disastrous Rollout. In this, he is talking to 20 current and former employees at CD Projekt Red. So we get to hear from the perspective of some of the actual developers on this game what went wrong, what led to some of the missing features, to the bugginess, and of course just the utterly poor performance on last-gen consoles, and even provide some context on some of the public-facing messages we've seen from CDPR. There's a lot of big reveals in this one, and I definitely know for some people, this will be one of those articles that really serves to change their perspective on CD Projekt Red overall. And actually I have a few of my own opinions on some of this stuff stated that I definitely will be sharing, and perhaps why it's getting a bit blown out of proportion. So right off the bat, as I mentioned before, for this article, 20 current and former employees were interviewed. It seems like for many of these, they were not higher level management, more either mid-level or much lower, just being developers working at the company, which is important to keep in mind. And one of the first things that's hit on in this is that statement made by the co-founder of CDPR. They recently released that 5-minute video. I made a full video going over and dissecting what is said there, but they mentioned how testing didn't show several of the problems players later encountered with the game. And actually, just as an aside, it seems like since this came out, they actually changed the wording here. It originally said, as it turned out, our testing did not show many of the issues you experience while playing the game, but instead now reads, as it turned out, our testing did not show many of the crashes you experienced while playing the game. Which seems like utter BS, and we kind of get confirmed here that devs saying that many common problems were discovered, there just wasn't enough time to fix them, and you'll see how that seems to be a common trend here. In that same video, although we heard the co-founder of CD Projekt Red saying one of the major reasons the game ran into problems was the streaming tech on base/gen consoles, for the developers we hear a bit of a different story as to why there were so many problems really across the board, and how one of the biggest hurdles was trying to develop the game engine at the same time as the game. Cyberpunk 2077 is using an updated version of The Witcher 3's engine, and has a wide variety of improvements and advancements over that engine. But apparently CD Projekt was not devoting a ton of time to getting the engine working first, so then of course devs could freely start building atop those features using some of the advancements made in the engine, but rather just doing the two things at the same time. And you can naturally see how this could lead to a lot of problems. Quite literally running into engine limitations consistently because those advancements simply haven't been added in yet. And the dev interviewed here described how even just a several month head start for the engine would have made game development a lot smoother. It also seems like one of the major problems is what happened in 2016, and we had some suspicions that something big happened internally in 2016, and it's basically described how in late 2016 full development of the game did begin. But also when this started, it seems like CD Projekt Red also hit more or less a reset button on the game. Prior to late 2016, of course, they were working on The Witcher 3 until earlier in 2015. Then it looks like there's some pre-production or just not all hands on deck with Cyberpunk quite yet. You had those giant expansions for The Witcher 3 also to consider, but when development finally did start in 2016 for Cyberpunk 2077, it seems like CD Projekt Red basically hit the reset button. They changed a lot about the game, and it seems like the studio director may have changed. This is a rumor at the time, all the way back in 2016, as the director that was on The Witcher 3 seemed to have departed from Cyberpunk 2077, and we got the new one, the person that is currently the studio director on Cyberpunk 2077. This being a big problem because that studio lead decided to take a lot of the work that was done in Cyberpunk already and just completely overhaul it, between the game, the story, and even the gameplay perspective. Apparently up until 2016, for all of the development thus far, the game was still a third-person perspective game, but it was decided then that it was instead going to be switched to the first-person perspective. It seems like some of the staff at the studio disagreed with some of the decisions being made, and even some top developers from The Witcher 3 ended up leaving due to these disagreements at the time, and it really seems like that 2016 moment really marked a pivotal point. And although late in 2016 seems to be when full development did begin, it also seems like even some of the stuff that did have quite a bit of development time already was scrapped or redone completely anyway. Although throughout the development it was described how a major focus of CD Projekt Red was impressing the outside world. The demo we saw at that 2018 E3 event was mostly faked because many of those underlying features, or just the underlying features of the game overall, were not implemented yet, which is one of the reasons many of the features showcased during this demo never actually made it into the final game. There's been a lot of posts highlighting this, going over some cut content or removed features. I'm actually going to make a full video on this, but this gives a lot of context as to why this probably happened. They basically created this really nice slice of the game that looks really pretty, but it isn't really the game. And several devs do say that the months that went to creating that demo, that slice of the game, should have gone to actual dev time because it definitely could have been used. So in this one, I actually feel a bit more divided. Having a kind of slice of the game or artificially propped up demo to be showcased at an E3 event is actually really common. I don't think that's the most egregious action ever by CD Projekt, and that demo, even if it was kind of faked, did have massive success for this game. It did propel the hype to totally new levels. And I think if the game ended up coming out and being fine, it wasn't a buggy mess, that wouldn't really be an issue. The demo served its purpose. The one side of it that does rub me the wrong way, even though many demos are faked like this, we often don't get a full 50 minutes of kind of claimed to be raw footage. Due to the way the demo was styled, the length of it, it made it seem like this was really the game. They're just playing the game casually. But considering in hindsight how artificial that really was, it does make it feel quite a bit more misleading than perhaps a 5-minute demo that doesn't show nearly as much. One of the other things touched on is devs' pressure to work long hours. One of the devs citing how he worked 13-hour long days, 5 days in a row, and at some points even pushed past that 13 hours. It wasn't necessarily mandatory per se, but one of the other examples, not actually shared during the article but shared later on Twitter, is how one dev went to his manager and said he wasn't going to be working overtime. Before this, the CEO of the company said they would not require overtime for their developers, and the manager basically said back that, okay, he doesn't have to work overtime, but it's going to mean his other coworker will have to work longer now as a result of this person not working longer. And you could totally see how this could lead to technically you not having to work overtime, but a lot of people feeling pressured or required to do overtime anyway. And of course, later on there was mandatory crunch, but perhaps at this point it wasn't quite there yet. But then we get over to E3 2019, and this was a big one because it was the moment where it was officially revealed that the release date was going to be April 2020. Reportedly, this news was met with quite a bit of confusion by developers. One developer describing how he thought based on how the teams internally were progressing, the game wouldn't actually be ready until 2022 at their current rate. And I feel like this is actually one of those quotes from the article I need to take a step back on. In the article, it's basically just one guy was like, hey, I don't think the game would be ready until 2022. And we're seeing entire articles making it seem like a ton of people thought the game shouldn't release till 2022. It's literally just one guy. So though it is an important thing to take note of, I think again you might be seeing some of those headlines exaggerating this particular line. But something that doesn't seem exaggerated and seems extremely plausible is some employees actually described making internal bets as to how long until the game gets delayed again because that April release date just seemed so unrealistic and impossible. And reportedly, this push for an earlier release date led to the canceling of certain features and scaling down the size of Cyberpunk 2077's Metropolis overall, which is pretty unfortunate, but I could totally see that being realistic. When you get into the city, when you get into the world, there is so much there, but also so little at points. So many of those features that wouldn't necessarily have been critical to the game's success, but would have just made the world feel so much better and lived in, just aren't there in Cyberpunk, or at least not there to the degree you kind of hope that would make the city feel much more alive and add a lot on top of it. But also we go over what I found to be a pretty confusing part in the article. It's described how the company wanted Cyberpunk 2077 out before the new generation of consoles were even announced. So before Microsoft even announced the Xbox Series S and X and Sony announced the PS5. That was why they were targeting that April release date. We saw an announcement later on in June at E3. And this was reportedly because they wanted to double dip, launching on both old gen and then being able to release a upgraded version later on for next gen. That makes a ton of sense to me, but in the very next line, it's described how this next gen upgrade would be free. And of course, in reality, the next gen upgrade is totally free. So I find that kind of confusing. How are you double dipping if you get a free copy of the game on next gen? The double dipping narrative was actually a big one before release, that Cyberpunk 2077 was going to come out before the next generation of consoles to to in fact double dip. We saw Grand Theft Auto 5 do this phenomenally well. Of course, you had to buy the game twice though. It's probably one of the main contributors as to why Grand Theft Auto 5 is one of the top selling games of all time. But around the consoles, it seems like devs did raise concerns that the game could not run well on base last-gen consoles, and apparently those were largely dismissed. One of the big narratives overall throughout this article is apparently how the management were citing how they basically pulled it off with The Witcher 3, or how CDPR was the company to do The Witcher 3, so we would figure it out. It basically seemed like through the development of this game, they thought they would somehow get it done, perhaps in the final hour, perhaps even before then, but they had done it before, so they could do it again without concretely or really explicitly having a good plan as to how that would come to be. Reportedly, the pandemic also definitely hurt things and actually perhaps limited some of the testing on consoles. Since everyone had to work from home, many were playing and testing the game on PC, so to some degree this led to less play on consoles, although reportedly there still was quite a bit of experience and testing on consoles externally. And apparently at the time this tweet was sent out with the game going gold, there were still numerous bugs being discovered every day, as well as a bunch of broken features and even chunks of dialogue missing from the game. At this point, Cyberpunk 2077 internally was in a very bad state. That was the core article itself, but we got a few other pretty big things from Twitter that for one reason or another didn't make it into the article. It's mentioned how Cyberpunk 2077 had this almost free-for-all development style. So let's say you needed something, the example here is shaders, somebody would just make it to use it, but there's no pipeline in place to actually check if somebody else had already made that, likely leading to several things getting implemented numerous times by different people because they didn't know it was done already. And even further, the police system was done last minute, that's why it's just so janky overall. But with that said, that's the article on this one. And although I'm sure many people have pretty strong feelings thus far, an important thing to keep in mind is there's going to be some clear selection bias with this, and that's to say that over 500 devs worked on this game, and yet this article is only highlighting stories from about 20 or so. I wouldn't be shocked if for several of the things mentioned, it might just be coming from one or two sources. And that's not to say everything here, even most of what's stated here, is false, but it's just important to keep in mind the type of person that's going to reach out to a journalist to highlight some of these issues and not just keep quiet or not just complain to their coworkers, but to actually reach out and risk their job in the process is a particular type of person, which could lead to a certain degree of bias here. With that said, several of these things are kind of obvious, or it's almost like we had a pretty good idea some of this stuff was going on. You just now have a better idea of what was actually going on more directly. It seems like overall there just was not enough time to release this game, and there was a hyper focus on that next gen, trying to release around or as close to the next gen as possible, apparently even initially targeting before the announcement. I would imagine that management's focus on next gen was really the thing that kind of ruined Cyberpunk to a degree or led to having a disastrous launch. I can imagine a timeline where, let's say, next gen consoles weren't coming out till mid to late 2021 and this game ends up not getting pushed out at late 2020. They would probably be more comfortable with delaying it even further. And just taking it all together, it is important to consider this game, even though we found out about it 8 years ago, only had a full development cycle of about 4 years. One of the interesting narratives that has popped up with this article is that we saw this video from the co-founder because they were made aware of this article about to come out, and this article was going to be kind of big. It ended up being pretty big. A lot of people feel very strongly with the details shared here, and to kind of get ahead of this, the co-CEO actually did make that video. And there's nothing to actually back this up, but we do know Jason Schreier here reached out to CDPR for comment. They would have been aware of this article to some degree, and with how weird the timing of this video was, I could kind of get that. Why did they release this video a month after launch and not like 2 weeks after launch or a week and a half after launch or even sooner? So it's definitely a bit of a tinfoil hat theory, but it is an interesting thing to consider nonetheless. And overall with this article, I feel like most of it are things that we kind of suspected or would believe to be true. Almost all of it sounds extremely plausible as to things that would go wrong with this game, and honestly, it's a story we've heard many times. A lot of these other disastrous game launches have a lot of similar symptoms. The BioWare effect that they had with Anthem, thinking they could just pull it off because of the past games they have managed to create, not listening to employees, having bugs pop up and not enough time to actually fix them before release, over focusing on a certain release event like those new consoles coming out and it hurting the game overall. It just feels like the whole thing is really not that shocking. It's unfortunate that Cyberpunk 2077 found itself with this fate. Hopefully we find it gets updates and improvements over the rest of 2021. Maybe by mid to late 2021 it even will be in a release ready state, although I personally still have my doubts as as to how good it could become on last gen consoles. But either way, that's the article. Those are my thoughts on it. I'd love to hear from you guys down below. But until next time, I thank you all again for watching, and I hope to see you all later.